The burgundy dress hung in my closet like a ghost of better times. I'd worn it to Annie's high school graduation, then to her college commencement, and later to celebrate her first promotion at the marketing firm. Each time, she'd complimented how elegant I looked and how proud she was to have me as her mother. Now, as I smoothed the fabric over my 62-year-old frame, I wondered if this would be the last time I'd dress up for my daughter. 3 weeks had passed since our explosive argument about her wedding budget, $65,000. That's what Annie and her fiancé Henry had demanded I contribute. Not asked, demanded. As if my late husband's life insurance money, the nest egg I'd carefully preserved for my retirement, was somehow their birthright. "Mom, you're being selfish," she'd said, her voice sharp as winter wind. "You're sitting on all that money while we're trying to start our life together. Don't you want me to be happy?" I tried to explain that happiness didn't require imported Italian marble for a bathroom renovation or a destination honeymoon in the Maldives. I'd offered $15,000, a generous sum that would cover a beautiful local ceremony. But Annie had looked at me with such contempt, such calculation, that I barely recognized the little girl who used to bring me dandelions and call them sunshine flowers. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was tending my small garden behind the duplex I downsized to after Harold's death. Annie's voice was different, softer, almost vulnerable. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said. Maybe we've both been too stubborn. Could we talk over dinner? I want to work this out." My heart had lifted despite myself. Perhaps the silence between us had given her time to reflect. Perhaps becoming a mother herself, she was 3 months along, barely showing, had awakened something in her that understood sacrifice, understood the weight of protecting what you'd built. "I'd like that, sweetheart," I'd said, already planning what I'd cook, what I'd say to rebuild the bridge between us. "Actually, Henry and I thought we'd take you out somewhere nice. You know, that Italian place on Meridian Street, Franco's." Franco's, where Harold had taken me for our 25th anniversary, where the tables were intimate and the lighting soft enough to hide the tears I suspected we'd both shed as we found our way back to each other. Now, as I applied my lipstick with the steady hand of a woman who'd learned to present strength even when she felt brittle, I allowed myself a moment of hope. Maybe Annie's pregnancy had given her perspective. Maybe she'd realized that family meant more than extravagant weddings and social media-worthy celebrations. The drive to Franco's took me through the neighborhood where I'd raised Annie and her older brother, Michael. Past the elementary school where I'd volunteered in the library, past the park where I'd pushed her on swings until my arms ached. Past the community center where I'd taught her to waltz before her first formal dance. Each landmark felt like a page in a book I wasn't sure I wanted to close. Franco's looked exactly as I remembered. Warm brick facade, window boxes overflowing with late autumn mums, the soft glow of candlelight visible through gauze curtains. I checked my watch.
6:30, exactly.
Annie had always appreciated punctuality, a trait she'd inherited from her father. The hostess, a young woman with kind eyes, led me to a corner table where Annie was already seated. My daughter looked radiant in the way only pregnant women can. Her skin glowing, her dark hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. She wore a designer dress I didn't recognize, something that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 2 months. "Mom." She rose to embrace me, and for a moment, breathing in her familiar perfume, I felt the familiar surge of maternal love that had defined my life for 34 years. "You look beautiful, sweetheart." I meant it. Whatever our differences, whatever pain lay between us, she was still my daughter. "How are you feeling? Any morning sickness?" "Better now. The second trimester is supposed to be easier." She touched her belly with a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "Henry should be here any minute." He got held up at the office. Henry Smith, 36 years old, ambitious, charming when he wanted to be. He worked for a commercial real estate firm and had the kind of confidence that came from a life without significant setbacks. I'd tried to like him, tried to see what Annie saw beyond his expensive suits and casual dismissal of anyone he deemed less successful than himself. "I'm glad you called," I said, settling into my chair. "I've missed you." Something flickered across her face. Was it guilt? Regret? But before I could examine it further, Henry appeared at our table, not alone, but followed by three men in dark suits carrying briefcases. Mrs. McKinney, Henry said, his smile too bright, too practiced. Thank you for joining us. The men took seats around our small table, transforming our intimate dinner into what felt like a business meeting. My stomach tightened as I recognized the choreographed nature of their arrival. This wasn't coincidence. This was planned. Annie, I said carefully. Who are these gentlemen? Mom, these are some colleagues of Henry's. Her voice was steady, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. They have some paperwork they'd like you to look at. One of the men, silver-haired with the kind of predatory smile I'd learned to recognize in my years as a secretary at the law firm, leaned forward. Mrs. McKenna, I'm Richard Kirk, Henry's attorney. We've prepared some documents that we believe will be beneficial for everyone involved. The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that I'd experienced 3 weeks ago when Annie had first made her demands. But this time, instead of anger, I felt something colder. Something that had been building in the weeks of silence. What kind of documents? I asked, though I already knew this conversation would end badly. Henry cleared his throat. It's really quite simple, Mrs. McKenna. We're asking you to sign a power of attorney that would allow us to manage your financial affairs. Given your age and the fact that you're living alone now, it just makes sense to have someone younger handling your investments and property decisions. My age, I repeated quietly. I'm 62, Henry, not 92. Of course, he said, his tone patronizing. But you have to admit, these things are complex. Real estate markets, investment portfolios. It's not something you should have to worry about. I looked at Annie, waiting for her to speak, to explain, to show some sign that this ambush wasn't her idea. But she sat silent, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the table. The attorney pushed a manila folder across the table. If you could just sign here and initial there, we can get everything squared away tonight. I opened the folder, though I already knew what I'd find. Power of attorney documents that would give Henry and Annie control over my bank accounts, my house, my insurance policies, everything Harold and I had worked 40 years to build. And if I don't sign? I asked, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. Annie finally looked up, and the expression in her eyes was one I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, final. Then you won't see your grandson grow up, she said simply. It's your choice, Mom. But I think you should know that Henry and I have been talking to a lawyer about grandparents' rights. Apparently, they're quite limited, especially when the grandparent has shown a pattern of being difficult. The restaurant seemed to fade around me. The soft jazz music, the clink of glasses, the murmur of other diners, it all became white noise. I stared at my daughter, this woman I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through childhood illnesses, celebrated through every milestone, and tried to understand when exactly she'd become a stranger. I see, I said quietly. I reached into my purse, past my wallet, past my reading glasses, past the small photo of Annie and Michael that I'd carried for years. My fingers found my phone, and I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed.
Mom.
Annie's voice had a note of uncertainty now. What are you doing? I pressed the call button and waited for the familiar voice to answer. Hello, Michael. It's Mom. I need you to come to Franco's restaurant on Meridian Street now. Yes, I know it's late. I know you have work in the morning. Just come. I ended the call and placed the phone carefully on the table beside the manila folder. I think, I said, looking directly at Annie, that before I sign anything, someone wants to say a few words. The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire. Henry shifted in his seat, his confident facade cracking slightly around the edges. The three lawyers exchanged glances, the kind of look seasoned predators share when their prey doesn't behave as expected. Mom, Annie said, her voice taking on that wheedling tone she'd perfected as a teenager. There's no need to involve Michael in this. This is between us, is it? I folded my hands in my lap, surprised by how steady they felt. Because it seems to me that when you bring 3 lawyers to what you called a reconciliation dinner, you've already involved quite a few people. Richard Kirk cleared his throat. Mrs. McKinney, perhaps we should discuss this more privately. Family matters can be emotional. Can they? I met his gaze directly. How thoughtful of you to notice. 23 minutes. That's how long it would take Michael to drive from his apartment downtown if he hit the lights right. 23 minutes, during which I had to navigate this minefield without stepping on the explosives my daughter had so carefully arranged. Henry leaned forward, his salesman's smile firmly in place. Look, Mrs. McKinney.
Annie.
May I call you Annie? We're going to be family soon. You may call me Mrs. McKinney. His smile faltered for just a moment. Of course, Mrs. McKinney. I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're not trying to take anything from you. We just want to help you manage your assets more efficiently. Colleagues, he repeated, I see, and they are. Henry stood, extending his hand. Henry Smith, your sister's fiancé. These are some business associates of mine. We were just discussing some financial planning with your mother. Michael shook Henry's hand briefly, then sat down without acknowledging the lawyers. Financial planning at Franco's on a Tuesday night with Annie 3 months pregnant. He looked at his sister. How are you feeling, by the way? Any complications? I'm fine, Annie said, but her voice was smaller now, less certain.
Good.
That's good. Michael picked up the manila folder, flipped through it with the casual expertise of someone who'd seen plenty of legal documents. Power of attorney. Interesting. Mom, did you ask for help managing your finances? I did not. He closed the folder and set it aside. Henry, Annie, gentlemen, would you mind giving me a moment alone with my mother? Now, wait just a minute. Henry started, but Michael's voice cut through his objection like a scalpel. I'm not asking. Something in my son's tone, the same authority he used when dealing with difficult patients or uncooperative family members in the ER, made the lawyer shift uncomfortably. Henry looked to Annie for support, but she was staring at her hands again. We'll be right over there, Richard Kirk said, gesturing toward the bar area. Mrs. McKinney, please don't make any hasty decisions. After they'd moved away, Michael leaned forward, lowering his voice. Mom, talk to me. What's really going on here? For the first time that evening, I felt tears threaten. Not tears of sadness, but of relief, of recognition, of knowing that at least one of my children still saw me as a person rather than a resource to be managed. They want me to sign over power of attorney, I said. Annie says if I don't, I won't see my grandchild. Michael was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm I remembered from his childhood. Something he did when he was thinking hard, working through a complex problem. How much did they ask you originally for the wedding? 65,000. He whistled low. And you offered 15, which is generous. More than generous. He glanced toward the bar where Henry was gesticulating to the lawyers, probably explaining why this family meeting wasn't going according to plan. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. Are you having any problems? Memory issues, confusion, anything that might make them think you need help managing your affairs? I almost laughed, except nothing about this situation was funny. Michael, last month I balanced my checkbook to the penny, renegotiated my car insurance to save $200 a year, and caught an error in my property tax assessment that saved me $800. Does that sound like someone who needs financial management? No, it doesn't. His jaw tightened in a way that reminded me of Harold when he was truly angry. Not the quick flash of irritation, but the deep, cold fury that came from witnessing genuine injustice. It sounds like someone who taught her son how to manage money so well that he graduated medical school with minimal debt.
You worked for that.
I worked for it because you taught me the value of work. You showed me how to sacrifice for what matters. He looked toward Annie, who was watching us from across the restaurant with an expression I couldn't read. What happened to her mom? When did she become this person? It was the question I'd been asking myself for months, maybe years. When had my daughter's ambition curdled into entitlement? When had her dreams become demands? When had her love become conditional on what I could provide rather than who I was? I don't know, I admitted. Maybe I protected her too much. Maybe I made things too easy. Or maybe Henry happened to her. I followed his gaze to where my daughter's fiancé was now on his phone. His voice animated, his free hand cutting through the air in sharp gestures. Even from across the room, I could see the calculation in his posture, the way he positioned himself to command attention. You think he's behind this? I think he's a man who sees an opportunity. Michael reached across the table, covered my hand with his, but I also think Annie is 34 years old and responsible for her own choices. The question is, what do you want to do about it? Before I could answer, Henry was striding back toward our table, the lawyers trailing behind him like a well-dressed pack. Annie followed more slowly, one hand pressed to her stomach in a gesture that was either protective or performative. I could no longer tell the difference. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Henry said, not sounding sorry at all. "But we do have a timeline we're working with. The wedding is in 3 months, and there are vendors who need deposits, venues that need to be secured." "Of course," I said, standing up slowly.
Timeline.
"How thoughtful of you to mention that." I picked up my purse, checking to make sure my phone was easily accessible. Around us, the restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of couples sharing wine, families celebrating birthdays, friends catching up over pasta, normal people living normal lives, unaware that at table 12, a family was being dissected with surgical precision. "I've made my decision," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Annie's face went very still, and I smiled. The same smile I'd worn to PTA meetings when dealing with teachers who underestimated other people's children. The same smile I'd perfected during 40 years of marriage to a man who occasionally tested my patience, but never my loyalty. "I'll sign," I said. The relief that washed over Henry's face was almost comical. Richard Kirk actually smiled. Even Annie seemed to relax, her shoulders dropping slightly. But first, I continued, reaching for my phone. "There's someone else who wants to say a few words." I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I'd added just 2 weeks ago, a precaution I'd taken after Annie's first ultimatum. When a mother's intuition had whispered that this reconciliation dinner might be anything but reconciling. "Louise," I said when the familiar voice answered. "It's Annie McKinney." "Yes, I know it's late. Could you come to Franco's restaurant on Meridian Street? Bring the documents we discussed." Henry's expression shifted from relief to confusion to something approaching alarm. "Who is Louise?" I set the phone down carefully, noting how the simple act of making a call could change the entire energy of a room. The lawyers were whispering among themselves now, and Annie was looking between Henry and me with growing unease. "Louise Qualls," I said pleasantly. "My attorney." The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more dangerous. Richard Kirk's predatory smile had vanished entirely, replaced by the sharp focus of a hunter who'd suddenly realized he might be the one being hunted. "Your attorney," Henry repeated slowly. "When did you hire an attorney?" "The same day you started asking my neighbors about my mental state," I replied, watching his face carefully. "Did you really think Mrs. Anderson wouldn't mention that a nice young man had stopped by asking whether I'd been acting strangely lately? Whether I'd been forgetting things, making poor decisions?" Annie's face went pale. "Mom, we never." "You never what, sweetheart?" "Never had Henry drive through my neighborhood taking pictures of my house. Never had him chat with my mailman about whether I'd been paying my bills on time." I kept my voice conversational, almost maternal. "Never had his friend from the real estate office pull comps on my property to see what it might sell for." Michael leaned back in his chair, and I could see him putting the pieces together with the rapid assessment skills that made him good at his job. "Jesus, Annie, how long have you been planning this?" "It's not what you think," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" I opened my purse and pulled out a small manila envelope because I think it's exactly what it looks like, a systematic attempt to establish grounds for claiming I'm incompetent to manage my own affairs. I spread the contents of the envelope across the table. Photographs Henry had taken of my house, printed emails between him and a private investigator, copies of inquiries he'd made about my medical records, my banking habits, my daily routines. "Louise has been very thorough," I explained as the lawyers examined the documents with growing discomfort. It's amazing what people will tell a private investigator, isn't it? Especially when that investigator looks like someone's sweet grandmother. The youngest lawyer, the nervous one, was actually sweating now. Mrs. McKinney, I think there may have been some misunderstanding about our client's intentions. Oh, I understand the intentions perfectly. I gathered the papers back into a neat stack. The question is whether you gentlemen understood what you were being asked to participate in. Louise arrived exactly 12 minutes later, striding through Franco with the purposeful energy of a woman who'd spent 30 years practicing family law and had seen every variation of human greed and manipulation. At 70, she was small and silver-haired, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made opposing counsel underestimate her at their own peril. "Annie," she said warmly, settling into the chair Michael had procured. "And this must be your daughter." The contrast was immediate and devastating. Where I had been isolated at this table, surrounded by predators, Louise's presence shifted the balance entirely. Suddenly, Henry and his lawyers were outnumbered by people who actually understood the law. "Gentlemen," Louise said, surveying the group with the clinical assessment of a surgeon examining a particularly interesting tumor. "I believe you have some documents you'd like Mrs. McKinney to sign." Richard Kirk cleared his throat. "This is really a family matter, Miss Qualls, Louise of Qualls, Peterson and Associates. And you're quite right. This is a family matter, which is why I'm here to ensure that Mrs. McKinney's family relationships aren't being exploited for financial gain." She opened her own briefcase, removing a thick folder. "Now, before we discuss any power of attorney arrangements, I think you should see what Mrs. McKinney has already put in place." The papers she spread across the table were pristine, official, bearing the seal of the county courthouse. As Henry leaned forward to read them, I watched his face change from confusion to understanding to something approaching panic. "Irrevocable trust," Louise explained conversationally. "Established 2 weeks ago, Mrs. McKinney's assets, her house, her investment accounts, her life insurance policies, have all been transferred to the Annie McKinney Family Trust." That's when Henry started, then stopped, his legal knowledge apparently insufficient for the situation he found himself in. "That's what, dear?" Louise asked sweetly. "The trust," Annie said slowly, reading over Henry's shoulder. "It says the beneficiaries are your children, both born and unborn, with Michael as the trustee until they reach the age of 25. The implications hit Henry like a physical blow. I could see him calculating, recalculating, trying to find an angle that would still give him access to the money he'd been counting on. "But what about the wedding?" he demanded. "What about our expenses?" "What about them?" Louise asked. "The trust provides for educational expenses, medical care, and reasonable living costs for the beneficiaries. I don't see how an Italian marble bathroom renovation qualifies as any of those things." "This is ridiculous," Henry said, his composure finally cracking. "Annie, tell them. Tell them we had an agreement." "Did you?" Michael asked his sister quietly. "Did you have an agreement, or did you have demands backed by threats?" Annie looked around the table at Henry's angry face, at the lawyers who were already calculating how to distance themselves from this mess, at Michael's disappointed expression, and at Louise's professional calm. Finally, her gaze settled on me. "I'm pregnant," she said, as if that explained everything. "We need security. We need to know our child will be provided for." "Your child will be provided for," I said gently. "Better than you can imagine. The trust will pay for the finest education, the best medical care, every opportunity a grandparent could want to give. But Henry won't have access to a penny of it." "You can't do this," Henry said, his voice rising. "Annie is your daughter. You can't cut her out of your will over a wedding." "I'm not cutting her out of anything," I replied. "I'm protecting her inheritance from you." Louise smiled, the kind of smile that had probably terrified opposing counsel for 3 decades. "Mr. Smith, perhaps you'd like to call your own attorney, because I think you might need some independent legal advice about the implications of what we've discovered regarding your premarital investigation of your fiancé's mother." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Henry looked to Richard Kirk for support, but the older lawyer was already gathering his papers. "I think," Kirk said carefully, "that we may have been operating under some misunderstandings about the nature of this situation. Perhaps it would be best if we postponed any document signing until everyone has had time to consult with their respective counsel. Excellent idea, Louise agreed. Mrs. McKinney, shall we go? I think you've accomplished what you came here to do. I stood slowly, taking my time, letting the weight of what had just happened settle over the table like dust after an explosion. Annie was crying now, silent tears that might have been genuine grief or calculated manipulation. I found I no longer cared which. I said softly, and she looked up with something that might have been hope. When you're ready to have a real conversation about this baby, about your future, about what family actually means, call me. But call me alone. I turned to Henry, who was staring at the trust documents as if he could change their contents through sheer force of will. As for you, I said, my voice carrying the authority of a woman who had spent 62 years learning how to recognize predators. Stay away from my family. Stay away from my house. And if I hear you've made one more inquiry about my competency or my finances, Louise and I will have a very different kind of conversation about harassment and elder abuse. Michael stood as well, pulling money from his wallet to cover whatever drinks had been ordered. Annie, he said to his sister, you're welcome at my place if you need somewhere to think, but you come alone and you leave the financial scheming at the door. As we walked toward the exit, I could hear Henry's voice rising behind us, arguing with the lawyers, with Annie, with anyone who would listen about fairness and rights and the unfairness of it all. The sound followed us out into the cool evening air, where it was absorbed by the vast indifference of the universe. How do you feel? Louise asked as we stood on the sidewalk outside Franco's. I considered the question carefully. Inside the restaurant, my daughter was probably trying to salvage her relationship with a man who had seen her primarily as a pathway to easy money. Inside, Henry was learning that there were still women in the world who couldn't be intimidated or manipulated into surrendering what they'd built. Free, I said finally. For the first time in months, I feel free. Louise nodded approvingly.
Good.
Now comes the hard part, which is deciding what you want to build with that freedom. 3 weeks later, I stood in my kitchen making coffee for two, watching the morning sun paint geometric patterns across the linoleum floor Harold and I had installed 23 years ago. The house felt different now, not empty, but peaceful. There was a distinction I was only beginning to understand. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock. I'd come to appreciate punctuality even more since Franco's, since I'd learned the value of people who said what they meant and did what they promised. Right on time, I said, opening the door to find Janet Waters holding a covered casserole dish and wearing the kind of smile that suggested she had news to share. I brought my grandmother's cornbread, Janet said, settling into the kitchen chair that had become hers over the past weeks. And I heard something interesting at the grocery store yesterday. Janet had appeared in my life like a small miracle disguised as a coincidence. 2 days after the dinner at Franco's, she'd knocked on my door, introducing herself as my new neighbor, a recent widow who downsized to the duplex next door after 45 years in the house where she'd raised 4 children. At 67, Janet was trim and energetic, with silver hair she wore in a practical bob and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen enough of life to know what mattered and what didn't. More importantly, she had a gift for listening without judgment and a complete immunity to other people's drama. What kind of interesting? I asked, pouring coffee into the mugs we'd picked out together at the antique store downtown, part of what Janet called my reclaiming project. Henry Smith was at the bank yesterday, she said, accepting her mug with a satisfied expression of someone who enjoyed a good story. Apparently, he was quite upset about some accounts being frozen. I sat down across from her, noting how natural this felt, having someone to share coffee with, someone who understood that gossip could be a form of justice when it exposed the right truths to the right people. Frozen accounts. Seems his business partner discovered some irregularities in their escrow account. Something about client deposits being used for personal expenses. Janet's eyes sparkled with a particular pleasure that came from watching Karma work with efficient precision. Word is he might be facing some professional difficulties. I absorbed this information with the careful neutrality I'd perfected over the past month. Since Franco's, I'd learned that revenge was most satisfying when it was served by someone other than yourself. when the universe simply adjusted itself to reflect the natural consequences of poor choices. And Annie, I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Shopping for wedding dresses at the outlets in Greenville. Apparently, the Italian marble bathroom renovation has been postponed indefinitely. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking our coffee and listening to the sounds of our neighborhood coming alive. Children walking to school, cars starting, the familiar rhythm of ordinary life continuing despite the small dramas that occasionally disrupted it. Have you heard from Michael? Janet asked. Yesterday, he said Annie called him asking if he thought she was making a mistake. I set down my mug carefully. He told her that was a question only she could answer. Smart boy, smart man, I corrected. He gets that from his father. The phone rang, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that had become my body's automatic response to unexpected calls. But when I checked the display, it showed a number I didn't recognize, a local area code, but not one in my contacts. Mrs. McKinney. The voice was young, female, nervous. This is Diana Reed from the Meridian Community Center. I hope I'm not calling too early. Not at all. How can I help you? Well, this might sound strange, but we heard about your situation from Louise's calls. She mentioned that you might be interested in some volunteer opportunities. I looked at Janet, who was listening with the polite attention of someone who'd learned that other people's phone calls often contained interesting information. What kind of opportunities? We have a program for seniors who are dealing with financial exploitation. People whose families or caregivers are trying to take advantage of them. Louise thought you might be uniquely qualified to help. The irony wasn't lost on me that my own family crisis might become the foundation for helping others navigate similar treacheries. But there was something appealing about the idea. Something that felt like turning poison into medicine. Tell me more, I said. For the next 20 minutes, Diana explained the program. Seniors helping seniors, sharing strategies for recognizing manipulation, resources for legal protection, emotional support for those who'd been betrayed by the people they'd trusted most. It was part support group, part advocacy organization, part early warning system for a community that was increasingly targeted by sophisticated scammers, both professional and familial. We meet Tuesday evenings at 7. Diana concluded. Very informal coffee and conversation mostly, but we've helped quite a few people avoid situations like what Louise described. I'll think about it, I said. Though I was already thinking about it, already imagining myself in a room full of people who understood the particular pain of being seen as a resource rather than a person. After I hung up, Janet was looking at me with the expression of someone who'd recognized something significant. You're going to do it, she said. It wasn't a question. Probably good. You need something that's yours, something that has nothing to do with being anyone's mother or grandmother or potential victim. It was exactly the right thing to say, delivered with the matter-of-fact wisdom that had made Janet such an unexpected gift in my life. She understood transformation not as a dramatic reinvention, but as a gradual reclaiming of space that had always belonged to you. The afternoon brought another call. This one from Michael. Mom, I wanted to give you a heads up. Annie's been asking questions about the trust, specifically about whether there are any ways to modify it. And I told her that irrevocable means irrevocable, but she seems to think there might be loopholes. She mentioned something about undue influence, about Louise pressuring you into decisions you might not have made otherwise. I felt a familiar stirring of anger, but it was different now. Cleaner, more focused. Not the helpless rage of someone being attacked, but the purposeful irritation of someone whose boundaries were being tested. Let me guess, I said. Henry's idea, probably. But Mom, she's the one making the calls. She's the one who chose to pursue this. I know. And I did know finally and completely. Annie was an adult who'd made adult choices, and those choices had consequences that extended beyond wedding budgets and bathroom renovations. There's something else, Michael said carefully. She asked if I thought you'd change your mind if she ended the engagement. What did you tell her? I told her that decisions motivated by money rarely lead to happiness, but that her relationship with Henry wasn't really my business.
He paused.
I also told her that if she wanted to repair things with you, it would have to start with an honest conversation about what she'd done and why she'd done it. And she hung up on me. I absorbed this information with the same calm acceptance I'd brought to every revelation of the past month. Each piece of evidence that Annie had chosen Henry, chosen money, chosen manipulation over family, simply confirmed what I already knew. That my daughter had become someone I didn't recognize. And that protecting myself from her choices was not cruelty, but necessity. Michael, I said, I want you to know that whatever happens with Annie, it doesn't change anything between us. You're a good man and a good son, and I'm proud of the life you've built. Mom, his voice was thick with emotion. I keep thinking I should be able to fix this somehow. Mediate. Find some middle ground. Some things can't be fixed, sweetheart. Some things can only be accepted. After we hung up, I walked through my house slowly, looking at it with new eyes. The living room, where Annie had played with dolls and later brought boyfriends for my approval. The kitchen, where I taught her to make pie crust and where she'd later announced her engagement to Henry. The hallway lined with family photos that suddenly seemed like documentation of a story that had ended. But endings, I was learning, were also beginnings. Tomorrow, I would call Diana Reed and volunteer for the community center program. Next week, Janet and I were driving to Nashville to visit the museum she'd wanted to see since her husband died. Next month, Louise and I were meeting to discuss starting a financial literacy program for women my age who'd never managed money independently. The future stretched ahead of me like an uncharted road. And for the first time in years, I was genuinely curious about where it might lead. There would be other dinners, other conversations, other opportunities to choose dignity over desperation, wisdom over wishful thinking. The burgundy dress still hung in my closet, but I was already imagining other clothes, other occasions, other versions of myself I had yet to discover. The woman who'd walked into Franco's 3 weeks ago had been someone's victim. The woman who'd walked out was something much more dangerous to people like Henry Smith. She was someone who could not be moved. 6 months after Franco's, I stood in the community center's main hall, watching 12 women and 3 men arrange folding chairs in a circle. At 72, Maxine Mikowski moved with the purposeful energy of someone who'd spent her retirement years discovering that age was just another challenge to overcome. Rosa Pratt Kelly, barely 60, but carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting her son's gambling addiction for years, carefully placed tissues on the small table in the center of our circle. A practical gesture that acknowledged the tears that often accompanied our Tuesday evening meetings. Annie's here early tonight, Janet murmured, settling into the chair beside mine. She'd started attending the meetings 3 weeks after I did, claiming she wanted to learn how to spot the warning signs of financial exploitation.
What she'd really wanted was to support me.
But Janet had a gift for making practical altruism seem like mere curiosity. I followed her gaze to where a new woman sat uncertainly near the door, clutching a purse like a shield. She was perhaps 55, well-dressed in the careful way of someone who'd once had money and was now learning to dress on a budget. Her hair was perfectly styled, but I could see the telltale signs of stress in the way she held her shoulders and the slight tremor in her hands. "First time," I said, recognizing the particular brand of shell-shocked dignity that accompanied people to their first meeting. "I'll talk to her after." The past 6 months had taught me that there were as many ways to be financially exploited as there were families willing to rationalize theft as love. I'd heard stories that made Annie's demands seem almost quaint. Children who'd forged their parents' signatures on reverse mortgages. Grandchildren who'd used their grandparents' credit cards to fund drug habits. Spouses who'd systematically emptied joint accounts while their partners struggled with illness. But I'd also witnessed recoveries that proved the human capacity for rebuilding was far stronger than the capacity for destruction. Louise had become something of a legend in our group, having helped 17 people establish protective trusts, prosecute 2 cases of elder abuse, and recover nearly $200,000 in stolen assets. "Good evening, everyone," I said, calling the meeting to order with the natural authority I'd discovered in myself over the past months. "For our newcomers, I'm Annie McKinney, and this is our weekly gathering for people who've experienced financial exploitation by family members." The words still carried a sting, but it was the clean pain of a healing wound rather than the infected agony of a fresh betrayal. I'd learned to own my story, to tell it without shame, to use it as a tool for helping others recognize their own worth. Tonight, we're going to talk about what comes after, I continued. After you've protected yourself, after you've set boundaries, after you've stopped the immediate threat, what comes next? It was a question I could finally answer with authority because I'd lived it. The immediate aftermath of Franco's had been about damage control and legal protection. But the real work had been quieter, more personal. Learning to trust my own judgment again, rebuilding relationships that mattered, discovering who I was when I wasn't defending myself against attack. For me, said Eddie Chase, a 78-year-old former teacher whose daughter had been systematically draining her retirement account, what came next was realizing I could live alone and like it. Nods around the circle. Independence was a common theme in our group. Not the fierce isolation that came from being hurt, but the satisfied solitude that came from choosing your own company over toxic relationships. I learned I didn't have to forgive anyone, added Sheila Phelps, whose son had stolen her identity to open credit cards. That was big for me. Everyone kept saying I had to forgive him because he was family. But Dr. Johnson helped me understand that forgiveness isn't mandatory for healing. Michael had become an unofficial counselor to our group, stopping by once a month to discuss the psychological aspects of family financial abuse. His insights had helped me understand that my guilt over Annie wasn't maternal failure. It was a normal response to an abnormal situation. What about you, Annie? Asked Carolyn Franklin, the newest regular in our group. What came after for you? I considered the question, looking around the circle at faces that had become familiar, dear even. These people had seen me cry, rage, doubt myself, and gradually find my footing again. They'd earned an honest answer. Purpose, I said finally. For 40 years, my purpose was being a wife and mother. After Harold died, I thought my purpose was protecting what we'd built, so I could pass it on to my children. But what came after was discovering that my real purpose might be protecting other people's mothers from what I went through. It was true. The volunteer work had evolved into something larger, a consulting practice where I helped other women navigate family financial crises. Louise had referred several clients to me, and I discovered I had a talent for spotting manipulation tactics and helping people develop strategies for resistance. How do you handle the sadness? Asked the new woman, speaking for the first time. Her voice was soft, cultured, carrying the particular sadness of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally altered. How do you stop missing who they used to be? The question hit the center of something I'd been avoiding. Because the truth was I did miss Annie. Not the manipulative woman she'd become, but the little girl who brought me dandelions. The teenager who'd called me for advice about boys. The young woman who'd been genuinely proud of her parents' marriage. I don't think you stopped missing them, I admitted. I think you learn to mourn them while protecting yourself from them. It's possible to grieve someone who's still alive. The meeting continued for another hour, covering practical matters, new legal resources, upcoming workshops, and success stories from former members who'd reclaimed their lives. But that question about missing them lingered, following me home to the duplex where Janet was waiting with leftover soup and the latest update on her own complicated family dynamics. How is group? She asked, settling into what had become her chair at my kitchen table. Good, hard? A new woman asked about missing the people our families used to be. Janet nodded slowly. At 67, she'd survived her own children's attempts to pressure her into selling her house and moving into assisted living, not because she needed care, but because they wanted access to her equity. Her solution had been to move into the duplex next to mine and inform them that their inheritance was now being spent on her happiness. Speaking of missing people, she said carefully. Michael called. Annie had her baby. The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting them for weeks. A granddaughter, Michael had told me earlier. Due in late October, according to his calculations from Annie's earlier pregnancy announcements. How is she? I asked, though I wasn't sure if I meant Annie or the baby. Everyone's healthy. They named her Ella Lehner. Ella Lehner, my mother's name. The manipulation was so transparent, so calculated that I felt momentarily dizzy with the audacity of it. Michael said Annie asked him to call you, Janet continued. She wanted you to know that visiting hours are flexible and that she'd very much like to see you. I sat quietly, feeling the pull of grandmotherly instinct warring with the hard-won wisdom of the past 6 months. Part of me wanted to rush to the hospital to hold this new person who shared my DNA, to forgive everything for the chance to be part of her life. But I'd learned to distrust my immediate emotional responses, to examine them for signs of manipulation, both external and internal. "What do you think she wants?" I asked. "I think she wants to use that baby to reopen negotiations about the trust." It was probably true. In the months since Franco's, Annie had made several indirect approaches: messages through Michael, cards on my birthday, carefully orchestrated encounters at places she knew I frequented. Each contact had carried the subtle suggestion that reconciliation was possible if I was willing to be reasonable about certain financial arrangements. "The baby isn't responsible for her parents' choices," I said, more to myself than to Janet. "No, she's not. But you're not responsible for protecting yourself from her parents' choices either." The next morning, I called Louise. "I've been expecting this call," she said without preamble. "Annie had the baby."
She did.
"And now I have to decide what comes next." "What do you want to come next?" It was the question I'd been asking myself since Janet had delivered the news. What did I want? Not what Annie wanted, not what Michael thought was best, not what society expected of grandmothers. What did I actually want? "I want to meet my granddaughter," I said slowly. "But I want to do it on my terms, with clear boundaries and without opening myself up to manipulation." "That's possible," Louise said. "We can arrange supervised visits through Michael. We can establish clear protocols about what topics are off limits, what behaviors will end visits, what consequences will follow if those boundaries are violated, and if Annie refuses those terms, then you'll know exactly where you stand with her. And more importantly, you'll know you protected yourself while leaving the door open for a genuine relationship if she ever chooses to walk through it." That afternoon, I drafted a letter to my daughter. Not the angry tirade I'd written and rewritten in my head over the past months, but a clear, calm statement of boundaries and possibilities. "Annie," it began, "I would very much like to meet Eleanor and to have a relationship with her as she grows. However, any contact between us must respect the boundaries I've established for my own well-being. I am willing to visit with Eleanor in Michael's presence for limited periods with the understanding that any attempt to discuss the trust, my financial decisions, or past grievances will end the visit immediately. If you can accept these terms, please have Michael arrange our first meeting. If you cannot, I hope you'll reconsider when you're ready to prioritize Eleanor's relationship with her grandmother over your relationship with my money. I will always love the daughter you were. I am no longer available to be victimized by the person you've chosen to become. With hope for your growth and boundaries for my protection, Mom." I sealed the letter before I could second-guess myself, then walked to the mailbox with the satisfaction of someone who'd learned the difference between giving up and setting terms. The future was still unwritten, but I would write it on my own terms, with my own pen, in my own voice. And if my granddaughter wanted to be part of that story, she would be welcomed with love, wisdom, and the fierce protection of a grandmother who'd learned that the greatest gift you can give a child is the example of a woman who cannot be moved.